Are you an aspiring leader who knows you have more to offer but you can't seem to get ahead? Do you frequently feel overwhelmed and under-supported? Listen to the Overcome to Become podcast as we talk about actionable tasks and mindsets that you can apply to begin leading yourself. Hi, I'm Dr. Angela Buckley, your host and author of the Strength in Nature Leadership Series and Likeable Leadership Reflection Journals. I'm a mother, consultant, triathlete, and coach. In Overcome to Become, I share with you the science-backed and experience-proven lessons I've learned in my own leadership journey to beat burnout. Hello. Please join me today in welcoming Kamini Wood. She's an entrepreneur, author, podcaster, and certified life coach who specializes in helping high achievers overcome anxiety, stress, perfectionism, and toxic relationships. As the founder and CEO of Live Joy Your Way and the creator of the Authentic Me method, Kamini empowers individuals to break free from limiting beliefs, release trauma, and rediscover their authentic selves. I am so excited to have her as part of our podcasting guests, and if you want to hear more from Kamini, swing on over and listen to her on her podcast, the Rise Up, Live Joy Your Way podcast. Hi, Kamini. Thank you so much for joining us today on Overcome to Become. This is our 5th season of Overcome to Become, this podcast that's really targeted at helping our audience members beat burnout, prevent all of those activities that get you and allow you to slide into burnout. And this season, we have been focusing on boundary setting, techniques for being successful with our boundary setting, expecting that backlash because, the people around us probably also need to make some adjustments, and how we can manage some of that backlash, manage setting things, and also being reasonable humans, like being flexible with our boundaries as well. So trying to really navigate the nuances in order to take care of ourselves and set boundaries. And I'm so excited to have you today here to talk to us about self-compassion, about boundary setting, and the work that you've been doing with your clients. And maybe you can share some insight for some of our people as well, how they can set boundaries, how they could be successful, and maybe even a story or two, what you've seen with some of your clients, because I don't want to say misery loves company, but we definitely learn from stories.
Oh, absolutely. And I just want to say thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here with you. So I am a human potential coach on a professional level, I should say, because on a personal level, I'm a mom of 5. But personally, or professionally rather, I am a human potential coach. I work with individuals on understanding themselves on a deeper level so that they can work through things like burnout, imposter syndrome, a lack of self-confidence, anxiety, stress, all of the overwhelm, all of that, because when we get to that deeper understanding of self, we can then take action to move through it, right? So it's never about diagnosis. It's always about, let me create some understanding in order to then decide how I want to move through. My journey to what I do is actually one of personal experience, as well as then going down the path of professional training. So I, by nature, I am definitely a people pleaser. I'm an overachiever. I'm an overfunctioner. So boundaries is a hot topic for me because I absolutely had to be in it to learn how to do it and to work it. And I'm still learning because I think we're all evolving and always growing. But I went through my own transformation, my own personal growth journey. I want to say I kind of hit a crescendo about a decade ago or so. And through that process, not only did I learn more about myself, but I recognized that I had always wanted to work with individuals on helping them just navigate whatever challenges they had. I didn't know what capacity that was. But as I went through my own journey, I realized I could do this professionally. So then, of course, I did the trainings. I've done a multitude of trainings in order to work with people wherever they're at, right? Because some people do great cognitively, but other people need to get to it somatically. So just really dove into that head first from an educational standpoint. So bring my personal experience along with the training together to do what I'm doing. And I've been doing it for my one-on-one practice, I've been doing for about 7 to 8 years at this point. So.
Excellent. Well, thank you. So I'm sure you have many stories to share.
Lots of experience.
Excellent, excellent. And also, Mom of Five, one of the things that I think about parenting that really helps in the leadership journey is so much flexibility. Every time you think you figured it out, they go and change. Those little kids grow, gosh darn it, which is wonderful. But and you have to do that 5 times over. And I don't think that it's the same every time.
Oh no, it is different with each one of them because they have different personalities. And then I'm managing, the 20 somethings with my oldest and my 2 oldest, I should say. And then my youngest is 11. So still in the preteen stage.
Oh
so I'm
my.
balancing 2 different worlds right now. And to your point, I mean, it is different because they each have their different personalities, but also my own parenting has changed and evolved over time because you learn and you grow and you recognize, like for me, and that's why part of my work is working with parents on mindful parenting and what does that mean. So my oldest will tease me about how I do not parent my youngest the same way that she got parented.
So I was the oldest of 4 and then my grandma has 32 grandchildren and I was one of the oldest, I think 3rd oldest in the ranking. And someone made a comment that I didn't parent like a first-time parent. And it's probably because I had all these young kids growing up behind me, right? Like you had. And I'm seeing this with my child that he is now starting to help a lot more with his younger cousins since we're close by. But it's interesting, the evolution. And I think what I want to encourage people to take away from parenting is that you can learn leadership lessons and boundary setting lessons everywhere that you are. And the home is a great, safe place to practice.
100%. Oh, I so agree with that statement. I actually equate a lot of my leadership coaching to parenting, believe it or not, because that is the place where we're in it 24/7, learning how to lead. So,
and we're definitely in it to win it, right? Like I want to be a successful parent because I want my child to be successful. And so it's hard to set the boundaries. I would say that's probably where I struggle most, if personally, is setting boundaries with my child, because I always think that they come first.
Yes.
Do you see that also with other clients?
I see that. And I also see the difficulty with setting boundaries as a parent with children because it's so difficult to see them disappointed, right? Because when we see them disappointed or upset or sad, as parents, we take that on and make it ours. And so that will keep many of my clients struggle with setting boundaries due to that, because they don't want to be the person that disappoints the child. And really it's about reframing what that boundary is being set for. Most of the time we're setting those boundaries for the greater good or the greater benefit of our child. And really the temporary feeling of sadness or disappointment can be worked through rather than avoiding it completely, because what that means is we avoid the boundary altogether, and then they don't get what they actually need. They're not getting whatever lesson or understanding that it is that they actually need for the longer term period of their entirety of their life, right? So, yeah.
So when you're working with clients, do they frequently come to you specifically because of boundary setting in general, or how do they get to you? Like when they are approaching, I've never had someone walk up and say, boy, I need help setting boundaries. But a lot of us can point fingers at people and say they need help setting boundaries. So how do you get someone into that conversation kindly and with compassion?
That is such a great question, because you're absolutely right. I don't think anybody has ever come to me and said, Kamini, I need help setting boundaries, and that's why I'm here. Usually it'll be some context of feeling stuck or feeling like something's not working, feeling just down, overwhelmed, anxiety. That's a big tell-all that, oh, wow, if you're feeling overwhelmed or burnt out, that could be boundaries. It's about carefully understanding and creating space for them to actually name where they're at, right? Because a lot of times that conversation around boundaries will naturally unfold as they start to get very clear on what it is that they're experiencing. And then you can introduce this idea of what even are boundaries, because most people they know boundaries, but a lot of people, the misnomer around them is that it's, pushing people away. And instead you open this dialogue around boundaries are really just naming for yourself what works for you versus what doesn't. And so it's
Okay.
actually for the benefit of the relationship where we might be struggling to set those boundaries. It's the way to have that healthy relationship is to go ahead and set those boundaries. And yes, I'm not going to, sugarcoat it. There will be times when you set boundaries with people and those people fall off. They say, I'm done. I don't want to be in this relationship. And that is absolutely very hard. But the key to remember is that they were benefiting from the lack of your boundaries in the first place. And were you really in an authentic relationship with them if you had to overgive, overfunction, whatever the thing may be? Were you really being in an authentic relationship? Was that healthy for you? And maybe, just maybe, setting those boundaries allows you to start differentiating and discerning who you can create healthy relationships with versus the ones that may not be long-term healthy for you.
So that's a great kind of segue for some people who maybe never had boundaries demonstrated, right? So we're talking about parenting, and the challenge that we have with children is we learn from our parents what was role modeled for us. And so if you're growing up in a family that didn't have boundaries, you didn't understand what boundaries are, how can you kindly learn to set your own? And I think most people still want to have a relationship with their family members, albeit perhaps a healthier one. How do you start those conversations, one with the client, and how do you help coach them in that conversation with their family?
The very first thing that I'll start in terms of the conversation with my client is for them to just get clear on, what are their needs and how are they feeling in certain situations, right? Because the feelings themselves are data packets. They're giving my client information on what values might not be being met, or what needs might not be being met, right? So it's not about the person that they're needing to set a boundary with at all in the beginning. It's about them. What is it that you need? What is it that you value? And then once they're able to name that, they're able to actually start that conversation and dialogue around who in their life might that not be being respected from or by, right? And so from that place, we then start dialoguing and conversing around, well, what might a boundary look like? What might the boundary be that you would need? And then we start creating space for how would I potentially to communicate to that person? I want to just reiterate again, because you said it in the beginning too, is like, it's difficult. It's also with my client, we talk a lot around, there'll be pushback, right? Because again, if we haven't ever had boundaries, it's never been modeled, we're going to be wonky and wobbly when we're trying to do it at first. And it's to give yourself some grace as you're doing that. But then it's also to recognize that the person that we're communicating to, this is new for them too.
Yes.
So there's going to be that discomfort on both ends. And so I really work with people on talking through that, because what will happen most often is people will get up the courage to start setting that boundary, and they go start having that conversation, and the person that they're talking to starts negatively responding pretty quickly. And then my client will then get scared and shudder and just stop. And it's like, never mind, right? And then we run away from setting the boundary. So it's important in my work to really be open and have that conversation around what that's going to look like and what might that experience feel like. And then also have ways to handle that and work through that, right? So learning that we might have to sit in the discomfort of somebody's response. And that also, it's relearning that that's not ours to manage.
Yeah.
Ours is to manage how we're experiencing the conversation.
When they come in and start with the conversation, have they maybe role modeled or practiced that conversation? Do they start with maybe the outcome first, having that outcome in mind? How do you approach that? Do you just call someone and say, hey, we need to have a boundary conversation? I don't know how to do that, right?
No, I mean, right. It's not very easy to just sort of come up with it and say, we need to talk about boundaries. I mean, I just had a conversation with a client just the other day around, in-laws. In-laws are a great place where we need to set boundaries oftentimes. And this particular client is really struggling because, he wants to feel like a good son-in-law, right? And so part of our conversation has been, well, let's define what good son-in-law is first.
That's a good one.
Because part of the stories that we tell ourselves is, and as a people pleaser, this is part of my story too, is it meant certain things, but part of that story is, well, maybe that's not true. Maybe being a good son-in-law in this particular case isn't bending over backwards and doing everything that my in-laws ask of me, but maybe my boundary is I can give you some advice on certain things, but I'm not going to do it for you, as an example. And so once that in our conversation, that became clear for him. I mean, he did ask, well, then how do I do this? Like, what do I do? What do I say?
Yeah.
And so really we know that people are going to ask things of us, right? And so it's allowing the conversation to happen naturally. But the next time that they ask, instead of jumping up and over functioning and just doing the thing that they're asking, being able to communicate, well, I'm able to do this, but not this, right? So he actually was able to say in conversation when they ask something of him, I'm not able to come to take care of those items, but I can offer you XYZ as advice. And they, at first the in-laws were very much like, what do you mean? I don't know what this is. Usually you come and help. And in that moment, it's really about knowing that you can let them speak. We don't have to shut them down or run away. It's, I hear, the disappointment that I'm not able to come and take care of those things. Unfortunately, I don't have the ability. My schedule doesn't allow it. But again, here are the things that I can offer in terms of advice. So we practiced that, and we actually role played it in our session. So it built some confidence that he was able to hold that space when having that conversation. But I've been working with this client for a little bit of time, and that's been coming up a lot though, is because he himself admits I'm a people pleaser. So in most of his relationships, there's the over giving and over functioning. And so he's noticing that he has to do this multiple times in multiple ways. And again, it's not, we need to have boundaries. It's in conversation, being able to naturally start saying, well, this works for me, this doesn't.
It's interesting because we work with a lot of engineers. And so my engineers have no problem if they get to a point, they're like, I need boundaries. These are boundaries. So they would use these words. But I also, you had another word you said earlier, that the emotion is a data packet. And I'm going to borrow that. That for my crowd is kind of gold, because they don't consider emotions quantifiable, right? Like it's all qualitative and even I was writing my dissertation and I kept telling my professor I wanted it to be quant, not qual, because that's the crowd I'm in. And he really pushed back and whatever. But then after I defended and all my engineering colleagues attended, he's like, you work in a very engineering world. Yes, I do.
Yes,
really
do. That is my reality.
So it's interesting to hear other people's stories and perspectives of how they're getting there and they're not comfortable to say boundaries. Because I think our people are like, oh, you said I need a boundary? Like, here's this brick wall.
Right.
It's all of the sudden.
Yes. And that can be very disconcerting for people though, right? When all of a sudden we've got this wall. I will often say that boundaries are more a fence. Like if we could just utilize them more as a fence, not a wall, right? So if we have porous boundaries, they're more like a suggestion, not really a boundary, right? They're like a house of cards that the wind blows, it's gone. But if we can look at boundaries as a fence, it's like, and yes, I mean, it's amazing if we could just simply say, hey, this isn't working, I need a boundary. But most people aren't, they're going to become defensive if we immediately go to that. So, and it's not, wouldn't say that it's, circumventing the conversation, but it's a way to have the conversation in a more, it's like empathetic leadership, right? How can we employ empathetic leadership? Make it more about, from this place of, I see where you are, this is where I am, this is what'll work for me, and this is what'll work for both of us together, right? And when we do that and we can lead from that place, it doesn't feel so abrupt, but we are, again, empathetic leadership, I believe, is where it's at in terms of building leadership. When we can come from that place, because then we're coming from a place of, I understand and hear what you're saying, but in terms of boundaries, this is what works for me, and let's work together to figure this out. We actually will see more success that way.
So it's interesting that you say fences, because we have an entire week-long visualization exercise on fences and different types of fences, like your front yard and your backyard and the gate.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone has to take out the garbage sometimes.
Yes. Yeah.
And people, like, I have visitors, they come to my house, and you know what they do? They leave. Thank you. And I am so grateful for the time that you spent here, but it is also time to go. And I will see you next time. And so understanding that that can be a healthy boundary
Yes.
is really useful. So I love that you're using the fence as well. It makes me feel included.
I love that you use the gate too, because I use that in my metaphor where in terms of boundaries, like you get to open and close said gate, right?
Yes.
So you can people in, but you can also say, okay, it's time for you to gonna close the gate.
Kamini, I haven't really heard anyone else use these metaphors, so I'm so happy to share that with you and hear that from you.
That's amazing.
That's awesome.
I love that synergy.
I love it. It's fantastic. Okay, so the gentleman that we were talking about, if we can kind of follow, has he also looked to the people around him to support him in his boundary setting?
Oh my
how
gosh.
does that work?
I love that you brought that up because it is so true that when we're embarking on something like boundary setting, if we try to do it in a silo or in secret, it's very difficult. It's not that it can't be done, but it's very difficult. So I always encourage people to, yes, reach out to your support system, reach out to the people that you actually trust and have conversation with them, open conversation of this is something I'm working on. So in his case, what we did was we actually we talked about how can he bring his spouse into the conversation with him. You know, this is what I'm working on. Well, first of all, this is what I'm noticing about me. I'm noticing that I'm lacking certain boundaries and it's putting me in a position of actually overgiving and it's actually creating some resentment, right? So really just helping name it and then saying, this is what I'm going to be focusing on working on. And what I really love is support around that, because especially when we have our loved ones or our support network and they see us showing up differently, it can be very disconcerting for them. So having that openness, first of all, it's healthy, but also then they can support, right? So then she can say, oh, I hear what he's doing, especially when it's in-laws. This involves her parents, right?
Yes.
So having her support is really important in this process, because if she didn't know that that's what he was doing, and then he's starting to set these boundaries and they have a big reaction to it, then she's going to potentially get really upset. What are you doing? What's happening? So it is important, I think, to be able to bring in your support network and also become your accountability partners, right? Because if you have been struggling to set boundaries, you might scare yourself off when somebody pushes back. So having somebody be kind of your personal accountability partner is actually also very helpful.
Are you familiar with the 3 scales that are used to measure burnout according to the World Health Organization?
I'm not familiar with the 3 scales.
So it's isolation, inadequacy, and cynicism. And there's a few questions along each scale and you get a score. And I think it's interesting to understand how people are reaching out to their partners and their friends to create a support structure as they're setting boundaries, specifically because of this isolation scale. How do we set boundaries in a healthy way that's communicating, bringing in our support network and creating a strong nucleus so that we can manage the boundaries or get support for the boundaries, especially at the beginning?
So the question that you're asking is, how do we bring them in?
Yeah.
I think from my perspective, well, first of all, isolation, I mean, that makes total sense that would be a huge part of, or one of the 3 main parts of burnout, because I do think that when we are isolated and we feel alone, because we're social beings, that would absolutely contribute. So when we're bringing in our support network or our spouse, I truly believe that it starts with bringing them in a way of letting them know how we are experiencing things. What are we experiencing and what are we feeling? It's never about placing blame on anybody, but it is about saying, this is what I'm noticing about myself, and this is what I'm feeling. And then we go into a place of, this is what I'm also needing, right? So as we're introducing them to the idea of a boundary, it's like, I'll take myself as an example with my people pleasing. If one of the things that I would say is like, I'm noticing that I am over giving and I'm over functioning with individuals. I'm not able to say no. What I'm needing to do is find ways to build my confidence around saying no and knowing that that's okay. I'm looking for support around, I'm looking for support when I do say no to somebody, just, vocal support, but also reminding me that it's okay to do that. Because if I know, like for me personally, I know that I will feel guilty afterwards. So my support system, I'm asking them to just be there to say, I'm really proud of you, or I really acknowledge that you said no today, and that's okay, right? Because that's the request that I'm making of my support system. So I'm being very specific with them of saying, this is what I'm experiencing, this is what I'm feeling, this is what I'm needing, and I'm going to be trying to set a boundary, and that what I need from you is X. That allows them to take part in our journey, but also they're understanding where it's coming from, instead of just simply going up to somebody and saying, I'm going to start saying no. They don't really know what that means, but now they have context. And it's not about justification or explanation. It's just to give our support network some context of what it is that we're working on, so they actually can authentically show up, because then it gives them an opportunity to say, well, I don't agree with that, and I'm not sure I can support you with that, which is also part of it, right? Because if our support system can't, we would want to know that at the get-go, so then we could either figure out who else we might need to bring in to the fold to help support us.
Right.
But it also opens up dialogue with that person to say, oh, that's interesting. Tell me more about that. Because obviously there's something maybe that we need to converse with that person as well.
You bring up a thought for me. We used to, we interviewed a business consultant, and it was for the absolute newbies. Hey, I have an idea. And the newbies would be new entrepreneurs or want to be developing ideas. They would reach out to their friends. And the consultant had said, don't ask your friends, because you're basically asking for permission. And I often think about that. Are you asking for advice, or are you asking for permission? And I wonder how that plays into some of the boundary setting when you're asking for support and maybe you're not getting it, or are you asking in the wrong way, or are you right? Because you just said, well, they may not agree, but what if what you're proposing is not healthy for you? I mean, right? Like I think there's a navigation. I don't know. I'm asking.
No, it's such a great point, because I think that what that calls into play is a couple things. And I think that's such a great point of, am I asking for permission? If I reach out to my support system, is it from a place of asking, is this okay? That's where your inner work comes in, that's why I say it's so important to really name for yourself, what are you experiencing and what is it that you need? Because if you're naming those things, when you're talking to your support system, you're very clear on what it is that you're needing. So instead of it being, I'm asking for permission to set this boundary, you've actually done the work to say, this is what I need. Now, on that note, though, if they're pushing back, what that does is, like I mentioned, it offers an opportunity to have more conversation. Because what if that support person is noticing something that you haven't recognized? So it allows for healthy dialogue. Tell me more. Let me get curious about why you're pushing back. Not, oh, I shouldn't do it, or, oh, let me just go find somebody else. It's converse with and get curious with, tell me more about that. Why are we, because now we're getting into the investigative portion of it, where it's like, okay, I'm hearing you. Let me understand. And then again, it comes back to agency and autonomy. Now that I have that information, what do I choose for myself?
How do you encourage a person who's new on this journey to choose curiosity over judgment or defensiveness? Because it's such a great word.
Yes.
And
yes,
the academic in me says, be curious, be curious. But I will also say the little girl in me from time to time is like, no, thank you. Right. Like I'm human.
Yes.
I say practice all these things, but I am not perfect.
Yes, we don't.
So,
Absolutely.
so
No, I mean, overachiever right here, who
right.
judgment was like the go-to. My answer to that is self-compassion, right? How do we practice curiosity over judgment? We lean into this idea of kindness over judgment. When something doesn't go the way that we want it to, instead of going into this place of self-judgment and self-criticism, we employ this idea of, what that didn't go the way that I wanted. What happened here? What can I learn from this? What can I take away from this? Those are curious questions, instead of sitting in, there's something wrong with me because I messed that up. Right. So the way through and how we shift into curiosity is to lean into kindness, lean into what would we tell a small child if they were in this situation? What would we say to them? Would we judge them, or would we offer some kindness and saying, well, that was tough, right? It's never about, self-compassion isn't about denying what happened. It's to actually say, well, this is a tough situation, or that did not go the way that I wanted it to. What can we take away from it? I mean, as a parent, I know that that's something that I have really employed with my kids, is like, okay, so you didn't, that class didn't go the way, or that exam didn't go the way that you wanted. Would I sit there and criticize them? Be like, what is wrong with you? No. Instead, I say to them, okay, like, let's talk about that. What happened? What did we learn? What could we maybe do different next time? Those are curious questions. So the way that we do that is to offer ourselves that same kindness that we would a loved one, or our child, or a friend. Just turn that towards self.
It's nice. It's a nice way. I'm listening and I'm thinking and applying some of your stories as I go through different situations, and it's interesting. My partner always says, but why do you think that way? Like when we're at a difference
Right.
happens, and he says, but why do you think that way? And it's such an opener for a healthy conversation that I have to learn to practice myself.
Curious question, right? Tell me more about your thoughts.
Yes. And it's a way too of like not being judgmental. Like I'm not on the defense when he says it like that. And so I can sometimes I can't explain, but I have the space. He gives me the space to explain. So
yeah, it's so funny. I love that question that he asks. That I've done a spin-off of that with my kids, which is, tell me more about that choice. Like when they've done something that maybe I wouldn't have agreed, like I wouldn't have done it that way. It's instead of like, why did you say XYZ to your sister? It's like, tell me more about the choice of that comment. Tell me more about that comment.
I think I say, how did that work out for you?
Yes, that's a good one too.
I think I could probably say it in a kinder way from time to time, because there might be some judgment in my voice, even if the words are nicer. But
maybe it's a tone, right? It's maybe.
Yeah, just maybe. Tone does play a role in our parenting successes. So,
fair. That's a fair statement.
Parenting is also a journey of self-growth.
Absolutely.
So we talked about compassion and compassion for self. And I'm wondering, as a people pleaser, it feels like we also are always talking about the compassion for the people around us, which is why we feel like we don't want to set those boundaries. How do we juggle compassion for self with compassion for others, and understand it, like explaining that when I care for myself, I can help you more. Compassion for self is actually compassion for others. How do we help people through that kind of conversation and sitting with the discomfort as they grow into it?
Yeah. I think oftentimes people think that compassion for self is actually selfish, right? And so part of it is working on the beliefs around that, and that recognizing that compassion for self is not selfish, it's self-full. And when we fill ourselves, we have something to then offer to others, right? Because we're not coming from an empty cup, so to speak.
Yes.
And the other part of it is that with especially as a people pleaser, there is a distinction between having compassion for somebody versus feeling responsible for their feelings, right? So I can have compassion for the fact that they might be disappointed, but I'm not ultimately responsible for the disappointment.
Okay.
So that's part of it too, especially in context of boundary setting, because I think what happens is we take on the responsibility for how that person is responding to the boundary. And so the work around that we have to engage in is, I'm setting this boundary and I'm going to sit in the whatever discomfort I might feel if that person is responding in a negative way, or how I perceive it to be negative. And recognize that that's theirs to work through, not mine. And it's actually doing a disservice to them, trying to fix that for them, because really that's theirs to understand what's happening for them, just as much as it's ours to do the work to figure out what boundaries we need and why we need them. And so it part of the work and what I do with clients is to talk about that discomfort and to recognize, like, to make space for the fact that you will have to sit in discomfort. It'll be inevitable that you will set a boundary with somebody. They will have a negative reaction to it, and just learning to sit with that, knowing that it's not your responsibility to fix that. If we set the boundary and we're really obnoxious about it in the way that we communicate it, there's responsibility in that, right? Yes, we own that. But if we're being loving and kind and we're just being really respectful and saying, this doesn't work for me, but this would, and somebody has a negative response, that we have to allow them to have that. And yes, it means we might have to sit with them, sit in that discomfort of knowing that they're uncomfortable. And that compassion to self says, I'm going to do my work to work through this, and I'm going to let them do what they need to work through it. And hopefully they can work through whatever their reaction is, and we can find a common ground. But like I said earlier, you may come up against some people who aren't willing to do that. And that's an invitation for you to take a hard look at, was that a relationship that was healthy for me in the first place?
So we said grace and space, and I told you one time that I had a little flip on the phrase. We had a lady at the office who didn't deliver and really took advantage of boundaries, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, the first time you want to say grace and space, right? Like, I want to give them a little bit of forgiveness and give them everybody a little bit of time to heal. But after it happened quite a few times, I said, I'm going to give myself the grace of giving her space. And we were done. We didn't allow our team to be overused anymore by that individual. But I think it's really important to understand that grace and space is not a one direction.
Yep.
And
yes.
I'm just wondering if you've ever seen how people navigate space, and do they come back together after a time? Can people heal through some of those rifts?
Yeah, I have seen both ends of it. I have seen some who, I love how you said that, grace, and then give her space. I've seen some individuals who take that space, and then they can do their own whatever healing or self work that they need to then come back together and really have an honest, healthy conversation.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen the other side of it too, where we give that person space and we recognize the dynamics that we were in were toxic or unhealthy. And the grace that we give ourselves is the ability to say, I'm okay moving on. Right. And there might be grief involved in letting go of whatever relationship that was. And that's, it's important to process through that sense of loss of whatever dynamic that was. But it's also recognizing that you then have made a real generative decision for yourself. Instead of just staying in something that wasn't working, you've created space to say, this doesn't work anymore. I think when I've seen people come back together, it's because both people are willing to do whatever self-reflection that they need to, and then have that really healthy conversation about what works for each of them and what needs are being met and not being met, or what values are being met and not met, right? And so when you're able to do that, you can come back together. So sometimes that space is necessary so that both people can do the reflection that they need to.
Yes, I think the space is helpful. And then to your point, right? Like, how are you self-full instead of selfish? And how do you navigate some of those? Because those can be rocky waters.
Yes. Yes.
And I think people go through times of life, right? Like sometimes they just need that space. And then the relationship isn't bad, but maybe they're just overwhelmed elsewhere. And
Right.
you're catching the waves.
Yes. That's such a great point. I mean, I've actually seen this in clients where they needed the space because they were overwhelmed and also potentially burnt out, and they needed to just refuel and refill. And then they were able to come back, and, it wasn't really the person. It was,
The
just the fact
situation.
that right. And that they needed to set boundaries for themselves more than anything. It wasn't even with somebody else. It was self boundaries.
Yes. Yeah. And that's real. John Maxwell always says, don't let the situation overcome the person. And I like that quote, as long as everybody involved is mentally healthy and there's not drugs or abuse or anything. But I also think there's a time where you have to say, here's your space and here's my space. So, like, I don't think it's apply it to 100% situation.
Right. Exactly.
Right.
I think when we get into that place of saying this is like the rule for everything, we're not leaving space for the fact that not everything, things can be similar, but they're not going to be the same.
Right. So I like the thought, but then I'm also like, okay, but I also am here for you when that doesn't work.
Exactly.
So,
Yeah.
So, Kamini, what from the 7-8 years that you have been practicing this, what's kind of like the first go-to nugget that you like to recommend? Like so the people who are at home listening today, they're like, hey, I think I could do a little bit better with boundary setting. What's the first thing that you would recommend for them to do? Get started.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's a self-evaluation of,
Okay.
What matters to me, right? So it's a values evaluation. Like
Okay.
where are my core values? What is it that are the things in life that are most meaningful to me? That's number one. And then number two is a needs evaluation. What is it that I need? And looking at different aspects, right? Like, what do I need in context of work? What do I need in context of certain relationships? What do I need in context of my own health and wellness? So you look at the different domains of life and you really get clear on the needs in each of those sections, because then you can step back into observer mode and be like, and ask the question, okay, now that I'm very clear on what my values and what my needs are in each of these sections, what's working and what's not working? And what boundaries might I need to set in place so that those values and needs can be met? And again, this isn't coming from a selfish mindset. This is a very self-full mindset, because if we go back to what we said before, if I'm self-full and I'm filled up, then I know that when I'm in relationship with others, I have something to give. So the very first place, though, is that self-work, is that understanding of self. What is it that I value and what is it that I need? And from there, everything kind of evolves.
Everything falls in. So start with values and then move to needs. Okay. That's a great starting place. So, Kamini, if somebody wants to reach out and learn more about the work that you do and maybe read, what can they do to get a hold of you? What can they do to learn more about what you're working on?
So my website is kaminiwood.com. And as a matter of fact, there's a blog on there that I've talked a lot about boundaries. So if they're interested in learning more about it, just hop over to the blog. And then, of course, I'm on Instagram and Facebook with the handle It's Authentic Me. And I'm also on LinkedIn with Kamini Wood.
Okay. Perfect. Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights, sharing the stories of your clients and also your children. So growing is such a adventure. So
Thank you so much.
thank you very much. I will make sure that everything goes into the show notes so that they can find those links. And I look forward to talking to you again and seeing you on the interweb. You've just listened to another episode of Overcome to Become. Thank you for joining me, Angela Buckley, your host, as we explored actions and mindsets to overcome the overwhelm and beat burnout. Did you know that when you learn to lead yourself, you can effectively learn to lead others? You can apply these skills in your home, at work, and in the community. If you'd like to learn more, join us in the Strength in Nature Learning Academy. We are currently featuring the Overcome the Overwhelm course with a 20% off coupon code, OTB2024. That's valid until the end of 2024. You can join me in my community at www.strengthandnature.com and on Instagram at creativelyefficient. Thanks for listening. I look forward to hearing from you soon.